what we want to accomplish tonight, just briefly look back at, kind of by review, look at some of the things that we talked about last week. We started talking about the translation of the Bible into the English language. That's kind of the final step in the process. If we've been looking at how we got the Bible, we chiefly, as American English speakers, we're talking about how do we get this Bible? How do we get something that we can actually read? And so we started looking at that process of translating the scriptures into the English language, and really got up to about the 16th century or thereabout. So we'll kind of review some of that so we know where we are. Spend a little bit of time talking about, well, why didn't we stop then? If we had a Bible generated in the English language that people could read, why has anything else happened in the next 400 years? Well, why are we still going? And there are still translations being made today. You're still finding companies, publishing companies, putting out new versions of the Bible, or revising the Bible. Why is that happening if we already have one? So we'll talk about a few of the things that drive that need for so-called newer translations of the Bible. And then kind of finish the process of looking at, all right, after the King James Bible or thereabout, what happens next, and how did we get to where we are with these English translations of the Bible, going up to really very modern times. I think the last one we'll look at is from 2017. So that's what we'll hope to accomplish tonight. Again, time permitting, and it may be against us. We'll find out. So we started in earnest, really. If we're talking about the English Bible, you're in some ways starting with the Wycliffe Bible in 1382, which is going to be that first translation of the whole Bible, the entirety of Scripture, into the English language, into that Middle English. And it is being taken from the Latin. It's not a direct translation from the original language. It's based on Jerome's text that he generated around 400 AD, 382 maybe. But you're going to have John Wycliffe making this seminal work in 382. The next place you would go is 1536, or again, thereabout. Tyndale did not really finish his work, but in 1536, you're going to find the first translation into English from the original languages. And as I mentioned, Tyndale didn't finish that. He did the New Testament and about half of the Old. I think the Pentateuch, maybe the former prophets, like what we would call the historical writings, I think the book of Jonah. And the rest of that work was left to one of his good friends and associates, Miles Coverdale. And eventually, I think his version, which was called the Coverdale Bible, kind of supplants the Tyndale version in his lifetime. But that work generally kind of put under the heading of the Tyndale Bible. A little bit after that, you have the Matthew Bible, or Matthew's Bible, and it is going to be the completed version of that whole tradition, sort of, that whole vision that Tyndale had of translating from Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic into English, and that is accomplished by a man named John Rogers. He did that under a pseudonym, Thomas Matthew. That's why it's the Matthew Bible, or Matthew's Bible. But 1537 there, you have the general work accomplished of saying we're going from the original text in Hebrew and Greek and some Aramaic, and we're putting that in English, making it all available from Genesis to Revelation. That work ends up being accomplished in 1537. Now, after that, you have kind of competing versions, I guess. And around this time as well, and there's a reference there on that slide to the Church of England. During this time is, in general, where you find Henry VIII splitting off from the Roman Catholic Church and beginning that Church of England. And so some of these texts that, for instance, Tyndale was killed for, that men were, posthumously made into heretics for, and their bodies exhumed and burned, as we talked about last week. That kind of heated persecution of this very idea of translating the Bible into the people's vernacular tongue, that is starting to lessen. Maybe in England, starting to be removed completely. and you find a more permissive attitude, even a more encouraging attitude from the monarchs, some of them, towards these translation efforts. And so there are several different versions, different translations that are going to be generated during this time, and they each kind of have their different levels of acceptance or preference based on who you would be talking to at that time. The Tyndale tradition gave the Great Bible, ultimately, and later the Bishop's Bible would come eventually from all of that in 1568. That's going to be the official book. If you go into a church building in England, the Church of England, that's what the priest is going to use. That's what they're going to be reading out of and speaking out of, is the Bishop's Bible. If you are a family that is privileged to have your own copy of the Scriptures, which would not be everyone, certainly, but from among the common people and families, they preferred the Geneva Bible and tended to have that on hand. If they had a Bible, that was the preferred one of the commoner, really. It had illustrations in it. It had some commentary added that kind of fleshed out the text. The Roman Catholic Church does also generate an English Bible during this time by a couple of French scholars. Douay-Rheims is going to produce from the Latin Vulgate, and you won't find an English, we'll talk about that tonight, you won't find an English Catholic Bible coming from the original languages for really a surprisingly long time. It's not going to happen until the 20th century, as far as I can tell. But that 1610 Douay-Rheims Bible is going to be used for quite a long time as the Roman Catholic Church's preferred English text. All right, looking at the main question then, or one of the main questions, why not stop? Why keep going? Why have we had more Bibles come out since the Bishop's Bible or the Tyndale Bible or any of those that everyone could read, everyone could understand those? Why do we still have more being made? Thoughts there? Okay, that's the cynical answer, Gary. A lot of money to be. What's the best-selling book of all time? Hands down, it's the Bible. So if I'm a publisher and I want to have a kind of a it's kind of like buying stock in some Fortune 500 reliable company. You may not double your money, but it's going to be a steady growth. If I want to produce something that people are going to buy, I can publish a Bible. Maybe make a new one and get people interested from a new perspective. And there are all these different kinds of Bibles that appeal to specific interest groups and things. The Green Bible, that emphasizes environmental issues and things like that. Yeah, I can put a little bit of a different spin on things, and that might become something that makes money. That would be the cynical answer, but it is truthful, probably, if we're being honest. Ian? Okay. Okay. All right. Maybe we find, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or like some other places where we can find more manuscript evidence, better manuscript evidence, more consistent, older, whatever the criteria might be for it being better. Really, the idea is just having more. Go ahead and put that up there. The discovery of more and at times better, in whatever way you want to qualify that, manuscripts that can settle some of those issues. Remember we talked about the idea of textual variance. There are different traditions of manuscript, maybe depending on where you are geographically. If you're recovering manuscripts from the western part of the Roman Empire versus the eastern, they might have a slightly different reading of a certain verse. As we mentioned, it never changes anything fundamental, but you might have a slightly different reading. Well, if you just have one that says this and one that says that, that might be tough to figure out. What did it actually say originally? If you end up discovering more manuscripts and you say, one says this and 5,600 say this, all right, I'll go with that one. That's probably what it was originally, and this one just messed up somehow. And so you end up having more evidence that can settle some of those questions. Just a few examples, and I'm not trying to make definitive statements on any of these examples, but these next three passages are verses that you will find different depending on what translation you're using. These quotes are all taken from the New King James Version. Where I have something bracketed, that means it's not in some modern translations, and in my estimation, should not be. I don't think that these were probably in the original autographs that John or Luke or Mark would have written. But we talked about this one recently there in 1 John chapter 5, that idea of inserting the idea of the Trinity into his discussion there in 1 John 5. Seems like, based on everything we've recovered in the last 100 years, seems like that was probably an insertion from some over-eager scribe who saw, yeah, this is cool. This kind of sounds like the Trinity, this threefold witness he's going to be talking about. It doesn't flow with the original thought. It doesn't flow with everything else that John is saying. And it's absent from many of the best manuscripts that we have available. Kind of a similar idea in Mark chapter 6. In Mark chapter 6, that second sentence there in verse 11, where he's talking about the day of judgment being more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for those cities that rejected him. It's parallel to a passage in Matthew. Jesus said that. He made that statement. But I don't think Mark wrote down that he said that. It's not in the oldest and best manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. It's easy to see someone conflating those two and putting it in that version, but it doesn't seem to have been the original intent. Acts chapter 8 and verse 37, I preached out of this on Sunday morning. I don't think verse 37 is there. Again, the idea of a man confessing his faith in Jesus Christ and that being the foundation on which he's baptized and is forgiven of his sins. Yeah, you can find that biblically. That's a scriptural idea. That's something that has good wisdom behind it. But it doesn't seem, based on all of the available evidence, that Luke originally included that in Acts chapter 8. Feel free to come to your own conclusions on those. Always, of course, do your own study. But ideas like that we typically find are going to change and shift over time as we discover more instances of the Scriptures. Michael, do you have anything?
Our languages continue to change.
Okay. How much of the King's English from 1611, or from whenever that first was documented, has changed? Do we still talk in Shakespearean English? Are we going to understand everything that would have been said then? I'll go ahead and put this first point up, and then I have some examples of the other. One other to add here. Scholarship in Greek or in Hebrew improves as it is something that is emphasized. For a very long time, we talked about this last week with Erasmus, a Dutch scholar who really started emphasizing studying in Greek particularly. If you have more people who don't just have to translate by going to a grammar or a lectionary and saying, okay, well, I'm told that this Greek word means this. That's how I would have to translate something. I probably could translate a passage written in Greek because I have books available that tell me, okay, here's what this Greek word means, and here's what this, noun, what the case is, and what all the tenses of the verb and all that. And yeah, I could work my way around to that. But if I'm a person who's been studying Koine Greek for 30 years, and you put a Greek text in front of me, then I can say, yeah, I'll tell you exactly what that means and why it means this, and not what someone else might have told you about it. So as that scholarship improves, we get better understanding of what those original words meant, and how they were used, and how combinations of words might have been used. We get a better sense of what the original intent was, and what the original readers were going to take away from it. That, to me, is very valuable. Along Michael's point there, though, some of the translations from those original texts were accurate in their time. And they said exactly what those people would be able to understand accurately at the time. But the English language changes. And some of those words or some of those phrases, idioms that they use, they fall out of common use. We don't understand them anymore. They're used in a different way. Hosea chapter 13, verse 8. I picked 4 examples out of, you can find thousands of these, I think, in the original King James Version. God says in Hosea 13:8, I'll meet them as a bear that is bereaved of her whelps, and will rend the call of their heart. And there I will devour them like a lion. The wild beast shall tear them. Whelps might give some people trouble. What's the call of their heart? C-A-U-L. I got to admit, before looking at this passage for this class, I didn't know that word. I was not familiar with that. It's an amniotic sac. It's commonly used of a fetus is in the call. And so God is saying really he's going to kind of pierce their heart. It's an amniotic membrane is what the call is. Neither, Job is told, or says here, neither is there any daysman betwixt us that might lay his hand upon us both. He's talking about himself and God. He needs a daysman. Might be able to figure that one out from context, but that's an arbiter. That's someone who's going to settle disputes. Daysman isn't a term that I have ever used in my life until 30 seconds ago. Revelation 1 and verse 13, he's seeing this vision. In the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. The paps sounds odd. That sounds very awkward to us, to talk about someone being girt about the paps with a girdle. That's a chest. On a man, it's a chest. It's often used biblically of a woman's breasts in the places where that occurs. It will be referred to there as the paps. That's not phrasing that we use anymore. Acts chapter 12 and verse 4, here he's talking about Herod arresting some of the apostles. When he had apprehended James, he put him in prison. Peter, rather, that is, delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Here we have a couple of examples of some of the things we're talking about. One is just a word that we don't use anymore. A quaternion is a group of 4 men or a squad. And so he's talking about 16 men or about that, that he delivered him over to. Then you have, of course, the idea of Easter being found there in the King James Version. It's Passover is the word that's actually being employed there, but in their day, they would just call that Easter. And so they just supplied a word that was familiar to people for that reason. So, outdated language, terminology that we simply don't use anymore. Again, it doesn't make those translations of things wrong. It's not inaccurate for those men to have used it. They did brilliant work. But that's not how we talk anymore. And doesn't it make sense if we're talking about the point of translation to get people to understand in their own language something that was written in another language, to actually use our own language? And the things we can find from Matthew Bible or from some of those other ones, we would say, that's not my language. I don't really speak like that anymore. Any other ideas, comments, questions? Why else would it be useful or necessary to keep on with these revisions and updates and new versions? Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
How many of us know what an Ebenezer is?
An Ebenezer, the stone of help. Yeah. Maybe. You get this idea in some songs too, don't you? Of saying, all right, do we really understand what we're saying? Sometimes that's inevitable, and that's why we always emphasize actually studying the Bible. You might come across a passage that is just sort of impenetrable unless you look at it deeper, or a word that is used maybe without translation in the original text, and you would need to come to that spot and say, okay, he's naming a stone Ebenezer. Why? What does that mean? And then you start looking at that stone of help and what the point might be. Ian?
Yeah. So along those lines, there's a few different modern, more recent versions. Like, there's certainly God in the Old Testament, and okay, if you read kind of the intro to whatever version you have, it tells you how they deal with those.
Yeah.
Right? You say the Lord when it's Adonai or whatever, and it's an all golden calf when it's Yahweh. Well,
Right.
some more recent versions actually say when it's Yahweh, they put Yahweh.
Right.
The Grammaton, I think that's helpful. And then also
more accurate is maybe the right way of looking at that. More specific, with more clarity, with more exactness. And that kind of comprises a few of those points that we've made of trying to get to the root of what exactly is this intending to say to us. And as our understanding of that language increases, and as our use of our language shifts, at times you need to take a step to say, all right, this is looked at a different way now. Let's use a different word and get across to the person who's going to be reading it what God actually wanted to get across. Gary.
One Bible that's used a lot today is the New International Version. If you look at Psalms 51 in the NIV, it says that David was born in sin. Hereditary told him to pray. They're teaching that with that verse and other verses.
Yeah, and we'll talk in a moment about kind of some of the different principles in translating. Is it going to be taken word for word or thought for thought? A formal equivalence or dynamic equivalence are the terms that will be used sometimes. So that has to be looked at as far as, again, what are we looking for in a translation? Something that accurately puts forth exactly what the original meaning was, or has there been editorializing that might have taken place? Something that's valuable to gauge when we're trying to pick a translation that would be useful. I'll add on here as another idea. Even slight differences in translation sometimes can really rejuvenate a familiar text. If you're like me, you probably have a Bible that you read out of most of the time, just for your daily reading or your, whatever it might be. I've had this Bible, I've mentioned it before, I've had that Bible since I was in 7th grade, this exact Bible, the New King James Version. I have a Bible that has this identical text layout at home that I study out of. It's a lot bigger than this one, it's in a lot better shape, but the words are on the same area of the page as they are here, which, again, if you're like me, you have a lot of those passages that are like, I can't tell you what verse it is, but I know where it's in the bottom left corner. And so sometimes when you're studying, it's kind of helpful to go, all right, and I can flip to that one easily and find where I want to be in the passage. And if I used a different, even if it was a New King James Version, if I used a different layout, I might be lost for a few seconds trying to figure out, now where was that? It's in Romans 6 through 8 somewhere. I don't know. I need to find it though. Well, I can find it in here. If that is the case with you, you have something that you're very familiar with. Sometimes you read a little bit different wording of that. Maybe it just uses one different word choice, or might put things in a different order, constructs the metaphor in a little bit different way. It's still an accurate translation. It's still telling you what the original says, but it's doing it in a slightly different way. And it looks totally different to you from reading it in that sense. And it's kind of like reading it for the first time. You get that whole new appreciation for something that you might have read so many times that the meaning of it is kind of dulled because you've just made that into something that you know or you believe just kind of because it's in there in your mind, not because God is saying it to me right now. And so that kind of revitalization from reading a new translation for the first time, I think can be very helpful. One of the reasons I would encourage while we're on this subject, especially if you're trying to do any kind of a deep study on something, but I think even just with our regular reading, switch things up at times. Look into different versions. And I would even encourage branching out a little bit to say, all right, maybe some of these translations that are known more for their readability than for their exact terminology, look at some of those as well. Make sure you're comparing them to what the original says and to something that is completely accurate, but a lot of times a sort of reader's version or a paraphrase translation might serve that same purpose of kind of getting me to look at things in a slightly different way than I might bring about some new life to the text and will help us get a better picture of what's going on. I think it's valuable to us that we have so many options available. Can paralyze us if we're not careful, I guess, but I think there's a lot of good to be found in that as well. Anything else to mention there? Comments, questions? other ideas. Yes, sir.
Is it really good to read other versions? So the version is in the translation, and the NIV is missing 30,000 plus different verses.
Yeah.
So I would say less of why should we look for readability instead of actually growing your ability to read?
That's a,
Actually knowing. So if you start from the beginning, you should learn from the King James backwards.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, well, I don't know how to read that. Learn how to read it. You learn how to read it.
Yeah.
So learn how to read it. It's the same. So this is the same with the NASB. Man who wrote that, he recanted back in the NASB version. So if we're not paying attention to what the actual writers are saying, if you have an NASB version, know that the author and editorial recanted writing the NASB version and said it was a travesty, he should have never done it.
Yeah.
And so there's certain things like historically in regards to each text, because a translation is not a version. A version that can be paraphrased, because paraphrasing policy, and since it's possible division, that's why we have 20,000 denominations, so everybody can pick their own thing.
Yeah.
So it's like if Satan wants, the easiest way for Satan is to masquerade his life. And so to make the Bible easy is to make it to where everybody can understand it. And Jesus said that was never the case. He spoke in parables. He spoke in rhymes. So if you're called, and you're saved by the foolishness of preaching, not by the readability of a common text.
yeah, I would say that what Jesus is getting at there, though, is not that, and I think from reading the parables, it clearly isn't the idea that he was going to use language itself that was intentionally hard to decipher, but that the point of those stories would be opaque to some of the people hearing them. And so I can easily get transmitted to me what the story was. I can read the parable of the sower and know what all of those words mean, and I can picture in my mind exactly the story that he's telling me, but I don't understand how that applies to the kingdom of God. In that way, I would say that the text or the meaning is hidden from those who are not called. But we would not find Jesus going to a group of people who spoke only Aramaic and preach to them in Coptic, or come up with some new language that they had not heard before and say, well, if you were called, you'd be able to understand it. He spoke in the plain language of the people, in the same way that when prophets were inspired in the New Testament to speak in tongues, that would be a pointless exercise unless there's someone there to translate what was being said. So it needs to be something that a person can understand and relate to. So for that reason, I agree heartily with a lot of your main premise there from the beginning. Do we need something delivered to us in exactly the way we talk? Do I need the Texan Bible that can put everything in exactly my vernacular? Or is there a responsibility on my end to say, all right, if I've read some of this and I don't know what some of these words mean, if I don't know what propitiation means or something like that, I need to figure it out. I need to look at a definition of that word and go to a Greek lexicon and figure out what that means in my language. I would definitely...
You should do that for all words, because
Definitely.
every word that's spoken is powerful.
Yeah,
If he is the word, you should look specifically at the word and make sure that you know exactly what you're reading. Because two
Yeah.
things can mean two different things.
Yeah.
One thing can mean 20 different things, or else you wouldn't have so many versions of the Bible.
right. But and that concept itself is what makes the idea of translation itself, I hate to use phrases like this sometimes, an inexact science. It is,
It's not science, that's the Holy Spirit.
but it is impossible to say that in the English language we can generate a completely accurate translation. I didn't say that. You're saying it. I'm not arguing with you. But the principle of translation itself, there's always going to be something that it's a different language. It's not a one-to-one corollary, and is not ever going to be with a language that varies in so many ways. So a decision has to be made on the meaning of a word. It could mean this, it could mean that. We're going with this version right now. And as we've talked about, maybe our understanding of what the best choice for that word is would change over time. Maybe as language evolves, the best language that's going to get that across the most clearly to the most number of people who are looking for it might change over time.
I was gonna say, I don't remember where I read it in the Bible, but they use the word enigma. Enigma,
Mhm.
which is a mystery within a mystery.
Yeah.
And I can't remember where it was, but it was there.
That's an enigma. Others then? All right. Briefly then, how do we get to where we are today? We've talked several times about in 1611, roughly thereabout. With all of these, you kind of have several different closely related versions, or New Testament first and then Old Testament, whatever might happen. But around 1611, you have the King James Version being completed. It was suggested, first of all, by John Reynolds. He was a Puritan churchman, and so in 1604 was sort of birthed the idea for this updated translation or revision, and that's really what you had essentially with the King James Version, the authorized version, as it was called. The Bishop's Bible of 1602 had undergone several revisions by that point, and so now in 1611 you have another one of those being completed. Dozens of scholars work on this, various religious backgrounds. A lot of the translations that we're looking at tonight, the ones that I would say are the best and most deserving of any attention or credence, are not the work of a denominational tradition. I'm going to gather 15 people who all think like I do, and we're going to produce the scriptures. You're much more likely in that case to get, what do I think they say? What do I hope they say? What do I want them to say? What can I make them say? And that's not a sound principle for any kind of translating. So the best versions that we're going to find are the result of people from different backgrounds who are having to set aside those things to agree with each other. What does it actually say? What is the best way of rendering this in our language? And that was a principle that began all the way back in 1611. Then you have a pretty big jump forward. You don't find anything substantive happening until 1885, and you find the English Revised Version. About 15 years of work went into this. First major work that is based on the earliest Greek text. And again, you have discovery process that is happening in between in those 260 years or so. Other Greek manuscripts that are shedding light on things. And so once again, you have a large body of scholarship contributing to this. Another revision of a text. They're not wholesale starting a new work from Genesis 1 and going through everything themselves. It is more just a sort of tweaking and perfecting process. But really failed to gain a whole lot of traction. Did not successfully supplant the King James Version. People still tended to prefer it. Which, by the way, I think, I meant to print those out to have them available. I think the King James Version would still be number 2, or maybe number 3. I couldn't remember. I looked at several top 10, best-selling translations as of today, like for the year of 2023. I think the King James Version is still number 3, which is amazing when you think about something over 400 years old. But still widely in use, of course. English Revised Version did not make much of a dent in that, even in its own time. In 1901, you have the American Standard Version. Really what this was the product of some of the men who had worked on that English Revised Version. You had American scholars alongside British ones and some other groups as well, but the American scholars who contributed to that work did not always have their preferences or their understanding of certain things, or maybe the way they would say them. Of course, Americans and Brits speak a different type of English, and so they agreed to wait 14 years, but after that 14 years was up, they published their own version, the American group that had worked on it. So very similar to the English Revised Version. 1952, you have the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. That's a revision of the ASV. Now we're getting into, and I'll have a diagram up in a moment, but you'll find different kind of families or traditions of these revisions that take place. And a lot of times that isn't apparent from the name of them. But a lot of the Bibles that are most common today are not new translations. It's going to be, this all started with King James Version, and then it was revised here, and then it was revised in two different ways there, and you kind of have a family tree of sorts. So the RSV is going to be a revision of the ASV. It's notable because there by 1952, around that time period, we've made some discoveries in those Dead Sea Scrolls and some more ideas that are going to provide useful documentary evidence. And the ASV is often kind of criticized for its language, maybe wooden, maybe unnatural in places. And so the RSV seeks to correct that and improve the general readability. That this sounds like something that would actually be said. This sounds like something that a person would phrase in my language. In 1970, we go to the New English Bible, which was the first major, among Protestants, the first major departure from that tradition, that King James tradition of English translations. It was not a revision. It was its own or kind of original work. Now also we find here the beginning of some of what Gary was talking about a moment ago, especially the idea of a translation that is not word for word. It's not literal. It's going to be more thought for thought. And with those, have to take extreme caution, have to be careful about what are we looking at. Is it something that a person interpreted, or is it something that a person translated, if there's a nuance to be made between those two words? So when the New English Bible came out in 1970, it was, depending on which camp a person might have been in, their view of the Bible and how it should be viewed, how it should be used maybe, was going to be either praised or condemned. Is this something that is taking extreme liberties with the text, and the fact that it isn't a word-for-word direct translation is something it should be condemned for, or the fact that it is put in slightly new language, that it is going to, what's the word I'm looking for? It is going to put things forth in a way that is new and different. Some praised it for its ingenuity. 1971, the New American Standard Bible. Again, another group of men, 32 scholars that really liked the ASV. We like that. We like the way it goes. I think it's a good translation, but nobody's buying it. Nobody's heard of it. Nobody's using it. And they were of the mind that should be fixed. That's something that I think people need to be looking at this version. They thought that it was one of the better ones to use. And so they went to the effort of updating that into more modern language. Again, 70 years elapsing in that time period. So you would have a lot of different words that would be used, and some of them very obvious, very clear surface level things. You read a thee and thou passage is going to be just something that's kind of an immediate, obvious change from one translation to the next. So you find several things like that happening in the 1971 New American Standard. Gary referred earlier to the NIV, the New International Version. Very similar in its methodology to that New English Bible from 8 years earlier that we talked about. It is also a standalone. It's not a revision of anything else, and it is a thought-for-thought translation, something we need to be aware of anytime we're reading a text. What was the methodology in generating this? If they tried to actually use the original words, or is it just going on that thought-for-thought dynamic equivalence? And so the NIV kind of vacillates between the two in some ways. By and large, it sticks close to the original words and word order, but does inject some of that commentary maybe into things. Known for its readability, this is and has been for many years the best-selling Bible in the world, I guess. All of the top 10 best-selling Bibles in the world, except for one, are English language. There's kind of the Spanish answer to the King James Version from 1609, I think. The Reina Valera is, I think, number 8 or so. But all the rest are in English. The NIV has been the bestseller from among all of those. Again, not vouching for its use on that grounds by any means, but it is simply one that has proliferated into a lot of areas of the world. In 1982, you have the new King James Version coming along, the most well-known, I guess, revision or update to that original 1611 King James Version that you have. It closely follows the King James Version. Most of the changes that you see, most of the differences do come in the kinds of things that we were talking about a moment ago. If you don't use some of the odd words that you find in 1611, you don't use those anymore. You instead find a word that you are actually familiar with in the New King James. You don't use thee, you use you, and that's the change that you find there. So most of those are going to adhere very closely, just simple updates to some of the archaic language that is found there. I think I am about to run out of time, and we still had several more to look at. So I think what I will do here, we'll go ahead next week and continue on along these lines, bring up some of the other ideas that were looked at as well as a way of kind of wrapping up our thoughts on this matter. But next week we'll be in the 80s still, I guess. We'll be in 1989 next week. We'll kind of put a capper on this and talk about some more of the ideas of what led us to being in this place. Thanks very much. Really do appreciate your time tonight. I'll look forward to the next one.